The South China Sea is no longer international waters, not legally, not according to any recognized principle of international law, not according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which explicitly rejected China's claims in a 2016 ruling that Beijing dismissed as, and this is a direct quote from Chinese state media, nothing more than a piece of paper. But in practical terms, in terms of what ships can sail where, what aircraft can fly overhead, what military forces operate in the region without being challenged, harassed, or fired upon, the South China Sea has become Chinese territory. It happened slowly, then all at once. Over the past 15 years, China has transformed a body of water the size of the Gulf of Mexico, a sea through which $3.5 trillion in global trade passes every year, into what military analysts now call a Chinese lake. It has built artificial islands where there were only reefs and shoals. It has constructed military bases on those islands, complete with runways, hangars, radar installations, and missile batteries. It has deployed Coast Guard vessels, naval warships, and militia fishing boats in numbers sufficient to physically contest any nation that challenges its presence. And the United States Navy, the force that has patrolled international waters since the end of World War II, the force whose presence has guaranteed freedom of navigation for the entire global trading system, is now operating in a contested zone where Chinese weapons can reach it, Chinese aircraft can shadow it, and Chinese doctrine explicitly envisions destroying it in the opening hours of a conflict. Today, we are going to explain how China took control of the South China Sea, how it built its military infrastructure there, what weapons it has positioned, what it means for American naval operations in the Pacific, and why the window for reversing this situation, if it ever existed, may already be closed. To understand what China has done in the South China Sea, you need to understand what was there before, and what China claims. The South China Sea is bordered by China to the north, Vietnam to the west, the Philippines to the east, Malaysia and Brunei to the south, and Indonesia at its southern extreme. It contains hundreds of small islands, reefs, atolls, and submerged features, many of them disputed between multiple nations. The Spratly Islands in the south, the Paracel Islands in the northwest, Scarborough Shoal near the Philippines. These are the contested features that have been at the center of decades of diplomatic and military confrontation. China's claim to the South China Sea is based on what it calls the 9-dash line, a demarcation drawn on Chinese maps that encompasses approximately 90% of the South China Sea, including waters that extend to within a few miles of the coastlines of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. China claims historical rights to these waters going back centuries. Every other nation with coastline on the South China Sea rejects these claims. International law, specifically UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China has ratified, does not recognize historical claims of this kind. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled unanimously that China's 9-dash line claims had no legal basis under international law. China's response was to ignore the ruling entirely. Chinese state media called it illegal and invalid. Chinese officials refused to participate in the proceedings. And China continued, accelerated, its program of physical presence in the South China Sea because it understood something that international lawyers do not always appreciate. In geopolitics, facts on the ground matter more than rulings on paper. The story of how China built those facts on the ground is one of the most audacious strategic operations of the 21st century. It began with what China called land reclamation, taking submerged reefs and coral atolls and physically building islands on top of them, using dredging ships to suck sand and coral from the seafloor and deposit it over the natural features until artificial land masses appeared above sea level. Between 2013 and 2016, China dredged and built at a rate that astonished the world. Satellite imagery tracked the process in real time as American and Philippine officials watched, protested, and did essentially nothing to stop it. By 2016, China had added approximately 3,200 acres of new land to features in the Spratly Islands alone, more than all other claimants combined had added over the previous 4 decades. But the land reclamation was not the end. It was the foundation. On Fiery Cross Reef, China built a 3,000-meter runway, long enough for any aircraft in the Chinese military inventory, including heavy bombers. Hangars were constructed, radar installations went up, weapons storage facilities were built, anti-aircraft missile batteries were installed. What began as a submerged reef became a fully functional military airbase in the middle of the South China Sea. The same process occurred on Subi Reef, on Mischief Reef, on Gavin Reef, on Johnson South Reef. 7 features in the Spratly Islands were transformed into artificial islands. 3 of them, Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief, became major military installations with runways, hangars, and comprehensive defensive systems. In the Paracel Islands, already occupied by China since 1974, the existing presence was dramatically expanded. Woody Island, the largest natural island in the Paracels, received additional military construction, including the deployment of HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems and YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missile batteries. By 2020, China had essentially completed the militarization of its South China Sea positions. The islands were operational military bases capable of hosting fighter aircraft, bombers, surveillance aircraft, and naval vessels. They were equipped with radar systems that could track every vessel and aircraft in the South China Sea. They were armed with missiles that could strike targets throughout the region. The United States had watched all of this happen. It had issued statements. It had conducted freedom of navigation operations, sending warships within 12 nautical miles of the artificial islands to assert that they do not generate territorial waters under international law. It had worked with allies to protest China's actions diplomatically. None of it stopped the construction. None of it reversed what had been built. The islands remained. The weapons remained. And the strategic reality of the South China Sea had been permanently altered. Let's talk about what those military installations actually mean for American naval operations, because this is where the strategic transformation becomes concrete. The 3 major Spratly Island bases, Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief, form a triangle in the southern South China Sea. Together, they provide overlapping radar coverage of virtually the entire South China Sea. Any surface ship or aircraft operating in the South China Sea is visible to Chinese sensors on these islands. The missile systems on these islands can reach any point in the South China Sea. The HQ-9B surface-to-air missile system, China's most capable long-range air defense missile, has a range of approximately 200 kilometers. From Fiery Cross Reef, that range covers an enormous swath of the southern South China Sea and approaches the Philippines. The YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missile, deployed on these islands, has a range of over 400 kilometers. An American surface ship transiting the South China Sea is within range of YJ-12 missiles for the majority of its transit. Chinese J-10 and J-11 fighter aircraft, operating from the island runways, can cover the entire South China Sea. H-6K bombers staging from the islands or from Chinese mainland bases using the islands as forward operating locations extend China's strike reach to the far corners of the region. What this means practically: an American carrier strike group transiting the South China Sea now does so under continuous Chinese surveillance within range of Chinese land-based anti-ship missiles and aircraft in waters where Chinese surface ships and submarines also operate. The South China Sea has gone from a body of water where American naval power was uncontested to one where American naval power faces significant risk. American admirals understand this. In testimony to Congress and in public statements, they have described the South China Sea as a contested domain. In private, the language is reportedly considerably starker. Now let's talk about the other instrument of Chinese control that gets less attention than the military bases but may be equally important: the maritime militia. China operates what analysts call a maritime militia, a force of fishing boats and civilian vessels crewed by personnel with military training and operating under RRGC-style direction from Chinese military authorities. These vessels are not naval ships. They don't carry naval weapons. They look on radar and in photographs like ordinary fishing boats. But they operate in coordinated formations. They block access to disputed features. They surround vessels from other nations. They use their hulls to physically prevent other countries from accessing their own claimed territory. And when confronted, they retreat behind their civilian appearance, creating a situation where any forceful response by a Coast Guard or naval vessel looks like an attack on fishermen. This is lawfare combined with physical coercion. It is designed to exploit the rules of engagement that constrain professional naval forces, rules that prohibit firing on unarmed civilian vessels, to achieve strategic objectives that those same professional forces could not achieve openly. In 2012, China used exactly this tactic to seize control of Scarborough Shoal, a feature within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone that the Philippines had controlled for decades. Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels surrounded the shoal, preventing Philippine fishermen from accessing it. When the Philippines withdrew its vessels under American brokered assurances that both sides would leave, China kept its vessels there. Scarborough Shoal has been under de facto Chinese control ever since. The same pattern has played out repeatedly in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard vessels using water cannons on Philippine resupply boats. Chinese militia vessels surrounding Malaysian drilling operations. Chinese surveillance of Indonesian fishing activities in Indonesian waters. Each incident individually is below the threshold of armed conflict. Together, they constitute a systematic campaign of coercive control that has progressively squeezed every other nation out of waters they have legally fished and operated in for generations. Now let's look at what the United States has actually done in response, and why it hasn't been enough. Freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, are the primary American tool for challenging Chinese claims in the South China Sea. The U.S. Navy sends warships within 12 nautical miles of Chinese claimed features, the distance that generates territorial waters under international law, to assert that those features do not legally generate such waters. FONOPs are legally important. They establish the American position that China's artificial islands do not have the legal status China claims. They demonstrate that the United States does not accept Chinese sovereignty over the South China Sea. But they have not changed the facts on the ground. The islands are still there. The missiles are still deployed. The militia boats are still operating. China has responded to every FONOP with a combination of verbal protests, military shadowing, and continued construction. The FONOPs have not deterred China's behavior. They have documented it. The United States has also worked to strengthen its alliances in the region. The Quad, the security dialogue between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, has been elevated from a working group to a leaders-level forum. AUKUS, the security partnership between the U.S., UK, and Australia, is providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, which will give a key U.S. ally significantly enhanced naval capability in the region. The U.S.-Philippines alliance has been reinvigorated, with the Philippines granting American forces access to additional bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. These are real developments. They improve American and allied capability in the region. They provide more basing options and more distributed presence. But they cannot undo what China has built. They cannot erase the military installations on the artificial islands. They cannot eliminate the anti-ship missiles, the surface-to-air missiles, the runways, the radar systems. The geography has been permanently altered, and no amount of alliance management changes that physical reality. Let's talk about what a conflict in the South China Sea would actually look like, because this is where the strategic transformation becomes operational. Imagine a scenario. The Philippines, exercising its legal rights under UNCLOS, attempts to resupply a small military garrison at 2nd Thomas Shoal, a feature within its exclusive economic zone where it has maintained a small contingent of Marines aboard a deliberately grounded ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, for decades. China's Coast Guard and militia vessels, as they have done repeatedly in recent years, attempt to block the resupply. They use water cannons. They physically obstruct the Philippine boats. In this scenario, the obstruction turns violent. Chinese personnel board a Philippine vessel, injuring Filipino sailors. The Philippines, citing its mutual defense treaty with the United States, which the U.S. has confirmed covers Philippine armed forces in the South China Sea, invokes the treaty. It requests American military assistance. The United States now faces the same choice it faces in every gray zone confrontation: respond and risk a conflict with a nuclear-armed China, or don't respond and watch an ally conclude that American security guarantees are worthless. If the U.S. responds, if it sends naval vessels to escort Philippine resupply boats, China has already positioned its forces for exactly this confrontation. The military installations on Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief are within 200 kilometers of 2nd Thomas Shoal. Chinese surface ships, Coast Guard vessels, and potentially submarines are already in the area. Chinese aircraft from the island bases can be overhead within minutes. The American escort vessels are now operating within range of land-based Chinese anti-ship missiles. They are under continuous surveillance. They are in a tactical environment that China has spent a decade optimizing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Close enough to Chinese bases that China enjoys local military superiority. Far enough from American bases in the Philippines or Guam that American reinforcement takes time. This is what denied access means in practice. Not that American ships cannot physically enter the South China Sea. They can. But they enter it at a disadvantage that previous generations of American naval officers never faced, operating within range of an adversary's land-based weapons under continuous surveillance in waters where the geography and the pre-positioned forces favor the adversary. There is a broader point here that goes beyond the South China Sea specifically. What China has done in the South China Sea is a template. It is a demonstration of how a determined, patient, strategically disciplined authoritarian state can progressively shift the facts of a region without ever crossing the threshold that would trigger a military response from the United States. Each step was individually deniable, individually below the threshold of armed conflict, individually manageable through diplomatic protest. The land reclamation was presented as civilian construction. The military equipment was moved in gradually. The militia boats were fishing. No single action was the one that justified a military response. But the cumulative effect, 15 years of consistent, patient, strategic action, has transformed the South China Sea from a body of international waters into a Chinese-dominated sea. Taiwan is watching. The Baltic states are watching. Every potential target of authoritarian revisionism in the world is watching. And what they are seeing is that the United States, with all of its military power, all of its alliance commitments, all of its declarations about rules-based international order, watched it happen. The lesson of the South China Sea is not that America is weak. It is that power without will is not deterrence. The United States had the military capability to contest China's construction in the South China Sea more aggressively. It chose not to, for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time, avoiding escalation, preserving the broader relationship with China, hoping that engagement would moderate Chinese behavior. Those choices had consequences. The islands are built. The missiles are deployed. The South China Sea is a Chinese lake. What happens next? China's position in the South China Sea is essentially consolidated. It is not going to voluntarily remove its military installations. It is not going to accept the 2016 arbitration ruling. It is not going to abandon the 9-dash line. The question for the United States and its allies is not how to reverse what has happened. That window appears to be closed. The question is how to prevent the same pattern from being applied elsewhere. Taiwan, the East China Sea, the Indian Ocean. The answers involve building more capable, more distributed military presence in the region. More submarines, the one platform that China's island-based defenses cannot easily target. More long-range precision strike weapons that can threaten Chinese installations from outside their defensive envelopes. More investment in allied military capability, particularly Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, so that China faces a more distributed, more resilient opposition. And they involve making clear in ways that are credible that the next attempt to create new facts on the ground, whether in Taiwan or elsewhere, will be met with a response that the South China Sea construction was not. Whether that clarity exists, whether the deterrent is credible, whether the lesson of the South China Sea has been learned rather than repeated. These are the questions that will determine whether the next decade in the Pacific looks like the last 15 years, or something far more dangerous. The South China Sea was once international waters. It is no longer, not in practice, not in the ways that matter for ships and aircraft and the nations that depend on them. China did this in plain sight, with dredging ships and construction cranes and fishing boats and diplomatic protests that nobody acted on. It took 15 years. It required patience, discipline, and a clear strategic vision that was never abandoned, regardless of who was in the White House or what the international community said. The result is that one of the world's most important bodies of water is now, in all practical senses, a Chinese lake. And the United States Navy, the most powerful in the world, patrols it at China's sufferance rather than by unchallenged right. That is the story of the South China Sea. It is also, potentially, a preview of what comes next. If you want to understand how the United States might respond, what a direct American strike on Chinese military forces in the South China Sea would look like, how China's carrier fleet fits into this picture, or what the next Taiwan crisis means for everything we've discussed today, subscribe now. Naval Power, because the ocean is where the next war begins.